Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over chapter 7 of the textbook. This is part 1, so in this part of the video we're going to be talking about feedback and reinforcement. And so all of you coaches, physical trainers, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, pretty much anyone who work with athletes directly, this chapter should be pretty useful for you. Hopefully you get something out of it. We're going to be talking about how to get athletes to change certain behaviors, what type of feedback is best to get them and keep them motivated, right? So again, hopefully you get something out of this chapter. Hopefully it's useful for whatever you want to do in your future, but we'll get through this chapter fairly quickly. And don't forget, there's a part 2 to this video. So let's get started. All right, here we go. Let's get started on part 1 of this chapter. We're going to be talking first about feedback and reinforcement. So first of all, what are the two? Reinforcement is the use of rewards and punishment in order to increase or decrease the likelihood of getting someone to do a particular behavior, right? To do it again. And then we have feedback, which is information about the accuracy and success of movement. So usually this comes in the form of augmented feedback, which is verbal feedback, right? Something you give to someone based on how they perform. So why use reinforcement and feedback? Well, reinforcing the learner, right? What does that mean exactly? It means to encourage repetition of the good things, of the correct actions that you want them to do. Feedback is essentially informing the learner, right? Informing them of what they need to do, how to do a specific movement, and maybe if they did something wrong, you're informing them for how to correct those errors. Third, reinforcement and feedback also help to motivate the learner. So by reinforcing something that they're doing it correctly, you're enhancing someone's confidence and you're inspiring greater effort and energy expenditure. If you're informing someone through the use of feedback, you're telling them how to do something more efficiently. And so if they are doing something with greater ease, that also motivates a learner. And for the bottom line, to improve performance, right? Coaches, you know this, but whether you know it or not, you are reinforcing behaviors and you are providing feedback. Hopefully you all do recognize that you're doing that, but the important thing is, are you using it correctly? And is it actually helping your athletes rather than hurting them? So let's talk a little bit more about that. Here are some approaches to influencing behavior. So if you're doing something that results in good consequences, so positive things, people tend to try to repeat those behaviors so that they can keep getting those positive things. So good consequences lead to people wanting to do it more and again, which is what you want. So the positive approach to influencing behavior is focusing on a reward. Focusing on a reward for a behavior that increases their likelihood to do it again in the future. So this is the more positive approach. The more negative approach is doing something that results in unpleasant consequences. So people try not to do these behaviors anymore because they want to avoid these things. And I'm sure as former athletes, at least most of us are, we can all remember when we had to do push-ups after like a bad serve or a missed free throw, right? When we had to do running due to letting a ball drop. All those different things are negative consequences, right? None of us who likes to do that. So these are considered to be unpleasant consequences. And so because we have those, we're trying not to do it again because we don't want to do those punishments again. So this is a more negative approach for undesired behavior. These types of consequences tend to decrease the likelihood of repeated behavior. We increase avoidance behavior and does not direct attention to the desired behavior. So again, I can recall so many times as a volleyball player where coach would throw the ball into play, and if someone let the ball drop to the ground, we all had to run. And rather than digging the ball the correct way and doing what you're supposed to, a lot of us just got super tired. And instead, since all he wanted was not to let the ball drop, pretty much me and my teammates just threw our bodies to the floor to make sure that we could get a hand in any hand on the ball, right? And not let it drop. So again, this is not this type of punishment or unpleasant consequences. It wasn't getting us to do what he wanted us to do, right? Which was dig the ball properly, move our feet. Rather, we were just throwing our bodies on the floor just so that we could touch the ball and not let it drop in order to avoid these unpleasant consequences. This negative approach is probably not what you want to do if there's something really in particular, a certain skill that you want your athletes to do. And so how does reinforcement work? This is a really good, just animated way of looking at it. So we have a behavior plus reward or praise. And so what does that make someone want to do? Do it again, right? It makes them want to repeat that particular behavior so that they can continue to get that reward or praise. And then if you have a behavior plus a punishment and criticism, right? So this is that negative approach, then that makes that person just want to avoid that behavior at all costs. So what form of reinforcement works the best? Is it positive or is it negative? If you think about it, you might have a particular idea about what you think works best, but it's not quite that simple. Okay, so let's look at it through these different principles, right? About how and why reinforcement can be really complex. It's not as easy as, oh, it should always be positive or it should always be negative. Why is that? Well, people react differently to the same reinforcement, right? So say we have a negative reinforcement, and again, it's to run every time you miss a serve. And so if you run after you miss a serve, maybe that gets you more pumped, right? Maybe it gets you really more motivated to get your serves in, as opposed to someone who, again, also runs, a teammate who's in the same boat, they get more down, right? They don't respond well to this type of reinforcement. And so really it makes them do worse and worse, right? So that's a different sort of mentality to the same negative reinforcement. Sometimes even if you give the appropriate feedback, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that an athlete will exhibit the same behavior. Sometimes maybe you're teaching a new pitcher in baseball how to throw a curveball, and he is able to throw it as a strike. That's great. You're giving him all the positive reinforcement, but he's not going to be able to do it every time. So even though you're applying the correct type of feedback and reinforcement, they may or may not really be able to respond to that feedback the way you want, just because the skill itself might be really difficult, things like that. It's also important to consider all types of reinforcements and how there might be competing motives based on the environment that you're in. Coaches may be really positive, for example, if they are training at a practice versus at a competition, more of a competitive environment. Athletes may not respond in the same way. And so they may respond better in certain situations using negative feedback, tell me what to do, help me fix this quickly, versus a competitive scenario where maybe they're not doing so well, but you are giving them more positive reinforcement. They may or may not respond differently to those types of scenarios. So reinforcement, it's a fairly complex idea, right, with different positions, whether you should use positive or negative. I know different coaches may be using different strategies that are maybe more appropriate for certain athletes or not. And really it depends on the athlete and how they respond, right? So again, it's very complex, and it ultimately just comes down to some of those principles of understanding your participants and what works best for them. Most coaches, I should say, and instructors combine positive and negative approaches. I imagine coaches try to do at least 50-50 of each, hopefully not more negative approaches than positive, but really it depends on the coach and what their philosophy is and way of coaching is, but obviously sports psychologists, they prefer that people adopt the more positive approach, right? So picking out the behaviors that you want to reward and spending your energy on that. There are a couple of things that you want to think about in terms of positive reinforcement. And the first is, what is the reinforcement that you're going to give? And so how would you know this? Typically, or the best way to do this is to ask that person directly, right? So what is it? What type of reinforcement do you want? Is it something social, like you get a break after this, right? Maybe you get a 5-minute break, a 10-minute break after this particular drill. Is it material? So some sort of material prize. Is it an activity? Do you get to choose the next activity for practice? Maybe it's a special outing, right? Maybe if we get this win, we'll all go out for ice cream, right? Remember, as a kid, that was always fun, being able to go out for ice cream after a game, right? If you do well. It's also important to think about the timing or the schedule of reinforcements. If they are young and still learning a skill, still learning a sport, you'll want to make sure that your timing of your reinforcement, so your praise or your criticism, you want to make sure it's continuous, right? You want to make sure that you're constantly giving them some sort of feedback, and you want to make sure that it's immediate. So as soon as they do something and you see that it might be wrong or that it might be right, you want to immediately give your feedback then. And then maybe you have an athlete who has already learned a skill and is doing pretty well. Then you'd want to observe the behavior, but you really don't need to see it every single time. They don't need to hear about it every single time. So you'll want to more spread out those types of reinforcements and feedbacks, right? Make it more intermittent, but still continue to do it immediate. Okay, so some more principles of positive reinforcement. Make sure you reward appropriate behaviors, and make sure you're choosing the proper behaviors to reward. In terms of difficult skills, shape the behavior of the learner by reinforcing close approximations of the desired behavior. So again, if you are teaching someone a very difficult, more complex skill, you'll want to teach these types of behaviors or these types of skills in more part behaviors, right? So doing a little bit of the behavior each time until you can put it all together and you get the desired behavior. So reward each sort of step along the way until they get to that desired behavior. Make sure you're rewarding performance as well as the outcome. So don't always just reward someone if they win. Make sure you reward them if they perform well, even if they do lose. Remember the task versus ego, achievement motivation. You want to be able to promote performance and mastery of a skill versus outcome, right? Versus just beating another person. And then lastly, reward effort. So in addition to performance, rewarding effort and a hard day's work is also really effective. And so let's get into the types of feedback specifically that you can give to your athletes. First, we have motivational feedback, which influences performance by, as you can imagine, what motivation means. So enhancing confidence, you're inspiring someone to continue giving effort, and you're creating a positive environment, positive mood, right? Telling someone that they can do it, that they're doing well. And then we have instructional feedback, which provides information about the specific behaviors that are to be performed, about levels of proficiency that should be achieved, so what you need to get to, the performer's current level of proficiency, so where you're at currently. And then it's also important to know that some people can really react differently to the same type of feedback. Instructional feedback is more me telling you what to do, how to fix your form, how to basically giving you instructions for how to do a certain behavior. Again, people can react differently to that, right? Are you the type of person who loves feedback, whether it's good or bad? Some people can only take positive feedback. So how do you help them in order to fix the type of behaviors that they need to fix? And so to get more specific about the types of instructional feedback you can give to someone, we have these two different types that you can say. So we have knowledge of performance, which is known as KP, and this is knowledge about the movement pattern that was used to accomplish the task. So why an outcome occurred. Why did an outcome occur? It's because you did this with your body. So let's use an example of someone shooting a free throw. Knowledge of performance, you're talking about a movement pattern. So maybe your elbows were too wide, right? Too far out from your body. That is why your free throw shot did not go in. And then you have knowledge of results. So this is information about the outcome of the action. So what actually happened? For the example of the free throw shooter, again, you can say your free throw was 2 feet to the right, right? Like you missed it 2 feet to the right. So what actually happened? The ball landed short. It was an air ball. Usually knowledge of results are sort of more obvious and you can usually see what the knowledge of results are. Knowledge of performance can be really useful if there's something in terms of movement that can be changed. Knowledge of results is more just telling someone how they did. So what not to do when it comes to feedback: do not focus on criticism. Do not focus on criticism with sarcasm. Do not use physical abuse, and do not employ guilt. So these are all pretty self-explanatory. These are not the types of feedback you should give someone. You shouldn't be sarcastic when you give someone criticism. Definitely don't punish someone with physical abuse, and don't employ guilt, making a player feel bad for not being able to do a particular behavior. Okay, so for my people who may not be as good as giving feedback, I'm the same way. I think, being overly critical or only, critiquing someone's behavior can be scary and not make you feel good, but somebody's got to do it. But here's a strategy to help with that in case you must always be giving someone feedback, right? This is usually how people like to receive feedback in general. And it's called the feedback sandwich. So which sandwich for you is more appealing? We got bacon on top and then bread, right? So let's say the bacon's the good stuff and then the bread's the bad stuff. You got something good and then you got a bunch of bad feedback, right? So that's A. And then we have B. Let's say the bread is good this time. We got good and then kind of the meat, which is the bad part, and then at the bottom we got good again. So which one's better? We're sort of loaded here on A with all the bad stuff, and then B, the bad is kind of smushed in between. Well, we would say that this B sandwich is a lot better, right? So first, reinforce learners by telling them something good. Tell them what they did well. Start with that. Then you could give some instruction for their improvement, right? So there's your criticism, some advice or instruction for how to help them to improve. And then you have 3, the bottom part, again, motivating your learners, right? Give realistic encouragement, tell them that they can do it. That's focused toward the individual themselves, right? So encouraging them specifically that they can do it. All right, to close out this first part of the lecture, what have we learned? 1, make sure you're catching your athletes doing something good rather than always looking for something wrong or incorrect. Be spirited and lively, but genuine. Make sure that when you're positive, all of that is genuine. Athletes, as you all know, can tell when it's fake. So make sure you are being genuine about what you have to say. Acknowledge students' effort at the task. So again, rewarding effort and rewarding just improvements for certain behaviors and skills. And then lastly, using the feedback sandwich. Super effective for pretty much everyone. Everyone loves a good feedback sandwich. So, all right, hopefully you learned a little bit something there. Again, part 2 to this chapter is coming up.